In this video, I'm going to show you 8 amazing European cities that are far better to visit in spring than in summer, and I'll explain why for each one. Sometimes it's the summer heat, sometimes it's the massive crowds, and in a few cases the reason is something much less obvious. I'm Roger from priceoftravel.com, and if you're planning a trip to Europe this year, timing can make a huge difference. So here are 8 European cities that are especially great to visit before the summer crowds arrive. First up is Paris, which is one of the most famous cities in the world and an amazing place to visit any time of the year. But in July and August, the main attractions get absolutely packed. Even if you reserve a time to visit places like the Louvre or the Eiffel Tower, you'll often still face long lines just to get inside, and once you're there, the crowds can make it much less enjoyable. Spring is a much better time to visit because the crowds are lighter and the weather is cooler, which makes walking around the city far more pleasant. Air conditioning isn't very common in many older buildings in Paris, so sightseeing during the summer heat can feel exhausting after a while. Interestingly, the middle of August can actually be a bit quieter than the rest of the summer because it's a major holiday period in France and many locals leave the city for vacations in the countryside. 2 quick recommendations. The hop-on, hop-off bus here might look touristy, but the route and sites are excellent and it's a great way to get oriented on your first day. And the 1-hour Seine River cruise around sunset is also well worth it. For a first visit, I recommend staying near Rue Claire, which is a charming market street full of cafes, bakeries, and wine shops, just a short walk from the Eiffel Tower. A good example of a hotel in this area is the Hotel de la Motte Picquet, which usually runs around $300 per night in spring and has excellent reviews. The main reason I mention it is that this area is an ideal location for sightseeing, so anything close to here will also put you in a great spot. I'll put a link to that hotel in the description so you can check current prices and see what else is nearby. Next is Rome, which is one of the most fascinating cities in the world, but it can be surprisingly exhausting to visit in the middle of summer. July and August are often very hot, and because the city is full of stone streets and historic buildings, it can feel even hotter once you're walking around all day. Rome also tends to feel crowded most of the year, and during peak summer the major attractions are completely overwhelmed. Places like the Colosseum and the Vatican museums draw huge crowds even in the off-season, so visiting in spring usually means shorter lines and a more pleasant experience once you're inside. Another thing about Rome is that it has a slightly chaotic feel compared with many other European cities. Even simple things like crossing the street can feel stressful at first, so dealing with that in extreme heat and heavy summer crowds can wear you out pretty quickly. Spring is much easier. The weather is comfortable for walking, and while the city is still lively, it doesn't feel quite as overwhelming. Public transportation in Rome isn't especially convenient, so it's really worth staying in a central neighborhood where you can walk to most of the major sites. The area around the Pantheon is one of the best bases for a first visit because you're within walking distance to the Trevi Fountain, Piazza Navona, and the Spanish Steps. One good example here is the Pantheon Caesar Relais, which usually runs around $214 per night in spring and has very good reviews. The main reason I mention it is that the Pantheon area is an ideal location for sightseeing, so really anything close to here will put you within walking distance of many of Rome's top attractions. I'll put a link to that hotel in the description so you can check current prices and see what else is nearby. Next is Barcelona, which is one of Europe's most exciting cities, but also one that has struggled with the impact of mass tourism in recent years. In fact, many local residents have openly protested the number of visitors the city receives each summer, and when you visit during peak season, it's easy to understand why. Barcelona's most famous areas simply aren't very large. Places like La Rambla and the area around the Sagrada Familia can become extremely crowded in July and August, which makes sightseeing far less enjoyable. Visiting in the spring months is a much better experience. The weather is usually warm and sunny, but the crowds are far more manageable, and it's easier to appreciate the city's incredible architecture, food, and street life. Barcelona's public transportation system is decent, but it's still worth staying in a central neighborhood where you can walk to many of the main sites. The Eixample district is a great base for a first visit because it's centrally located, relatively calm, and within easy reach of many attractions. One good example here is the Hotel Praktik Garden, which usually runs around $314 per night in spring and has very good reviews. Again, any hotel near this one that fits your budget will have a great location. Another city where spring makes a huge difference is Venice, which has been famous for extreme summer crowds for decades. The historic center of Venice is actually quite small, and there is essentially one main walking route connecting the Rialto Bridge and St. Mark's Square. During the peak summer months, that route can feel like a slow-moving shuffle through a massive crowd. Spring is noticeably more pleasant. The weather is comfortable for walking, and while Venice is never exactly quiet, the crowds are usually much more manageable than they are in July and August. Another important thing to know about Venice is that a large percentage of visitors are only there during the middle of the day. Many arrive from cruise ships or stay in cheaper hotels on the mainland, so the crowds are usually heaviest from about 10 in the morning until late afternoon. That's why it's worth paying a little more to stay on the main island itself. Early mornings and evenings in Venice are much calmer, and you'll get to experience the city when it feels far more atmospheric. A good example here is Residenza Goldoni, which usually runs around $187 per night in spring and has a very convenient central location. Next is Prague, which has some of the most beautiful historic architecture anywhere in Europe. A few decades ago, it was famous as an incredibly cheap hidden gem, but the secret has definitely been out for a while now. In the summer months, the crowds in the historic center can rival places like Venice. The narrow streets around Old Town Square and the route across Charles Bridge can become extremely busy, which makes it harder to appreciate the incredible buildings and views that make Prague so special. Spring is a much better time to visit. The weather is comfortable for walking, and the city is lively without feeling completely overwhelmed by tourists. Prices are also usually a bit lower outside the peak summer season. Prague's public transportation system is cheap and efficient, but it can feel a little confusing for first-time visitors, so staying close to the main sites is still a good idea. One good example here is the Seven Tails Apartments, which usually runs around $118 per night in spring and has excellent reviews. Prague has a wide range of hotel prices, so you can find cheaper ones and much nicer ones nearby. Next is Amsterdam, which is one of my favorite cities in Europe and a place I actually lived for a while. Unlike cities in southern Europe, summer weather here usually isn't scorching hot. In fact, you might still want to bring a light jacket even in July. The real issue in Amsterdam is the crowds. The historic center is quite compact, and the pedestrian routes between the main attractions are fairly narrow. In the middle of summer, those areas can become extremely busy, especially around places like Dam Square and along the famous canal streets. Spring is a much more pleasant time to visit. The weather is usually comfortable for walking and cycling, and the crowds are noticeably lighter than they are during the peak summer months. Hotel prices are also often a bit lower before the main tourist season arrives. Amsterdam has good public transportation, but for a first visit it's still worth paying a bit extra to stay in the historic Canal District, so you can easily walk to most of the main sites. One good example is the Prinsengracht Hotel, which usually runs around $276 per night in spring and has a great canal-side location, a short walk between the two main nightlife areas of Rembrandtsplein and Leidseplein. Next is Nice, which falls into a slightly different category because it's one of Europe's most famous summer beach destinations. Over the years, many people have asked me where to go to experience a classic Southern European beach scene, but honestly, I usually recommend avoiding those beaches in peak summer. In places like France and Italy, the most famous beaches are often incredibly crowded in July and August, and many of them aren't even that comfortable. Quite a few have pebbles instead of sand, and many areas require renting an expensive chair at a crowded beach club just to sit near the water. That said, visiting Nice itself in the spring is fantastic. It's a beautiful city with pleasant weather, and it makes a perfect base for exploring the French Riviera. One of the best things about staying in Nice is how easy it is to take short train trips to places like Monaco and Cannes, both of which are only around 20 minutes away. For convenience, I recommend staying near the Nice-Ville train station, and a good example hotel is the Hôtel du Centre, which usually runs around $147 per night in spring and has excellent reviews. The last city on the list is Lisbon, which until recently was considered one of Europe's most underrated travel gems. It's always been a beautiful city, and for many years it remained surprisingly affordable compared with places like Madrid or Barcelona. The secret has definitely started to spread in recent years, and summer tourism numbers have been rising quickly. Lisbon isn't quite as overwhelmed as some other European cities yet, but the crowds are noticeably larger in July and August. The good news is that Lisbon's climate is fairly mild even in summer because the city faces the Atlantic Ocean, so the weather here is usually more comfortable than in many other southern European capitals. Even so, visiting in spring is still a better experience. The weather is famously pleasant, the crowds are lighter, and the hotel prices are often a bit lower before the peak summer season arrives. As with most cities on this list, staying central is worth the extra cost so you can walk to many of the main sites. One good example is the 7 Hotel, which usually runs around $193 per night in spring and has excellent reviews. If you're planning a trip to Europe, timing really does make a huge difference. I've also put a companion article on priceoftravel.com with these hotel recommendations, and I'll link that in the description below. And if this will be your first trip to Europe, you might also want to watch my video on 11 easy Europe trips for first-time visitors, where I walk through several simple itineraries that combine famous cities like London, Paris, and Rome into trips that are easy to plan and easy to navigate. And if you enjoy practical travel advice like this, please take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more tips on planning smarter trips.